The Ukraine war just crossed into NATO airspace again, and Russian jamming may be why. NATO jet destroys Ukrainian drone over Latvia. A NATO fighter jet has shot down a drone over Latvia that has now been identified as Ukrainian in origin, turning what initially looked like another mysterious Baltic airspace violation into a far more complicated military incident. Latvia says the aircraft entered its territory as a result of Russian electronic warfare activity, raising the possibility that Moscow's efforts to disrupt Ukrainian attacks are pushing weapons into NATO airspace. The drone was destroyed over Latvia's Balvi municipality on the 14th of August, after NATO's Baltic air policing mission was activated. The episode ended without reported civilian casualties, but its significance extends far beyond one unmanned aircraft. NATO forces were required to use a combat aircraft against a Ukrainian-origin drone inside Alliance territory, while Latvia blamed Russian interference for creating the situation. What happened over Latvia? Latvia's national armed forces detected the foreign drone as an airspace threat during the night of 13 to the 14th of August. Air warnings covered several eastern municipalities before NATO fighters were sent to intercept the aircraft. The drone was eventually destroyed over Balvi municipality in northeastern Latvia. An Italian fighter participating in NATO's Baltic air policing mission carried out the interception, with Allied aircraft having been activated as the drone moved through the region. Latvian forces later secured and neutralized the wreckage. Authorities initially avoided publicly identifying its origin while the debris was examined, but the country's armed forces subsequently established that the aircraft was Ukrainian in origin. That finding changes the political complexion of the incident, but it does not necessarily mean Ukraine deliberately sent a drone towards Latvia. Latvia's military has instead connected the incursion to Russian electronic warfare. Latvia says Russian electronic warfare was responsible. The striking part of Latvia's original military statement was that it did not simply say an unidentified drone had crossed the border. It said the aircraft had entered Latvian territory as a result of Russian electronic warfare activity. Electronic warfare has become one of the most important and least visible parts of the conflict. Russia operates extensive systems designed to interfere with navigation, communications, and control signals used by Ukrainian drones, while Ukraine employs its own electronic warfare capabilities against Russian weapons. Satellite navigation can be jammed by overwhelming legitimate signals with interference. Spoofing goes further by feeding a navigation system false positional information, potentially causing an aircraft or unmanned system to believe it is somewhere other than its real location. For long-range drones traveling hundreds of kilometers, even relatively small navigation errors can become significant. A weapon intended to follow a route around defended territory could drift into another country's airspace if its navigation is disrupted strongly enough. That is especially dangerous around the Baltic. Latvia and Estonia sit immediately beside Russia, while Belarus lies to Latvia's southeast. Ukrainian long-range attacks against targets in northwestern Russia can therefore take place in a geographical environment where NATO territory is close to potential flight paths. The result is a new form of military spillover in which a weapon does not have to be deliberately aimed at NATO for NATO territory to become involved. What Russia may have done. There is an important distinction between Latvia saying Russian electronic warfare caused the drone's diversion and proving that Russia intentionally redirected a Ukrainian aircraft into NATO territory. The first is an assessment of what interfered with the drone. The second would require evidence about Russian intent. That distinction matters enormously. Russian forces have powerful incentives to jam and spoof Ukrainian drones approaching Russian territory. If one of those weapons subsequently loses its intended course and crosses Latvia, that could be an unintended consequence of electronic defense, rather than a deliberate attempt to create an incident with NATO. But the outcome is dangerous either way. Russia does not need to physically fire a missile across Latvia's border for its military activity to create a security problem inside the alliance. Electronic warfare powerful enough to distort navigation across a wider region can effectively export parts of the battlefield beyond Ukraine and Russia. That creates a gray zone in which responsibility can become difficult to establish in real time. A radar operator may know that an unidentified aircraft is heading into NATO airspace without immediately knowing who launched it, where it was originally supposed to go, or whether somebody has manipulated its navigation. The fighter pilot sent to intercept it cannot wait for a geopolitical investigation before deciding whether the aircraft presents a danger. NATO had to make a real-time decision. That is why the interception matters. NATO's Baltic air policing mission has traditionally been associated with protecting the airspace of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which do not maintain the kind of large fighter fleets required to police their skies independently. Allied states rotate aircraft through the region to provide that capability. The mission is now operating in an environment radically different from the one NATO faced before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Drones can be relatively small, difficult to identify, and far cheaper than the fighter aircraft sent to intercept them. Their intended target may also be unclear. A drone approaching a populated area cannot simply be assumed to be harmless because it may have become lost. Equally, shooting an unmanned aircraft down creates its own danger. Falling wreckage can threaten people and property on the ground, meaning an interception has to consider altitude, location, and the likely consequences of destroying the target. Latvia's military response shows how quickly these decisions are becoming part of routine defense on NATO's eastern flank. This is not an isolated Baltic problem. The August incident fits into a wider pattern of drones crossing or approaching NATO territory as the aerial war expands. Latvia has already dealt with other incursions. In May, its armed forces detected unmanned aircraft entering Latvian airspace from Russia. 2 crashed inside Latvia and another passed through its airspace before leaving. Estonia has faced a similarly revealing case. A drone assessed as likely Ukrainian entered Estonian airspace earlier this year and was neutralized by NATO aircraft. Latvian military authorities involved in coordinating that operation said it took place under electronic warfare conditions that included GPS jamming and spoofing. That earlier event is important because it shows the August episode is not an entirely new theoretical problem. Long-range Ukrainian weapons, Russian electronic countermeasures, and NATO territory are increasingly interacting within the same battle space. The geography gives commanders very little margin for error. Why Ukraine is flying drones near the Baltic? Ukraine has steadily expanded its ability to attack targets deep inside Russia using domestically produced long-range drones. Energy infrastructure, military facilities, logistics sites and assets supporting Russia's war effort have increasingly come within range. Targets in northwestern Russia create a particularly complicated geographical problem. The Baltic states and Finland sit close to areas of Russian strategic importance, while the Gulf of Finland leads towards the St. Petersburg region and major Russian infrastructure. Ukraine therefore has to combine range, navigation, air defense avoidance, and route planning while Russia attempts to detect, jam, spoof, and destroy incoming aircraft. Every additional long-range mission increases the possibility that something goes wrong. That does not absolve the operator of responsibility for safely planning missions, but nor does it make every diverted aircraft a deliberate intrusion. Modern electronic warfare makes the distinction increasingly difficult. The most dangerous scenario is misidentification. The immediate danger is not necessarily that one Ukrainian drone will trigger a NATO-Russia war. The more serious long-term risk is ambiguity. Imagine an unidentified drone crossing a NATO border during a large Russian attack on Ukraine. Radar systems detect it. Fighters scramble. Military commanders have minutes to determine whether it is Russian, Ukrainian, deliberately hostile, electronically diverted, or simply malfunctioning. Now add several drones simultaneously. Then add GPS disruption, conflicting radar tracks, civilian aircraft, and potential attacks elsewhere. The possibility of miscalculation grows rapidly. A relatively inexpensive unmanned aircraft can therefore create decisions involving fighters worth tens of millions of pounds, national air defense systems, and NATO military command structures. That imbalance is one of the defining problems of the drone age. Russia's electronic warfare is becoming NATO's problem. The Latvia incident also demonstrates that electronic warfare cannot always be contained inside conventional national borders. Powerful interference does not stop because a line on a map has been crossed. Civil aviation in the Baltic region has already had to contend with disruption to satellite navigation. Military forces must operate in the same contested electromagnetic environment while distinguishing between hostile weapons, diverted weapons, and civilian systems. For NATO, this creates a defensive challenge that missiles and fighter jets alone cannot solve. The alliance needs better detection, cheaper drone interceptors, resilient navigation, electronic intelligence and systems capable of determining what an unidentified aircraft is before commanders have to launch an expensive fighter response. Using high-performance combat aircraft remains necessary when the threat is unclear, but it is an expensive solution to a problem likely to become more common rather than less. Ukraine also faces an uncomfortable problem. The fact that the drone was Ukrainian matters. Kyiv depends heavily on political and military support from NATO members, particularly those closest to Russia. Latvia has been among the countries most strongly supportive of Ukraine since the invasion. Ukraine, therefore, has every incentive to prevent its weapons entering Allied territory. Even when Russian interference appears to be responsible, repeated incidents create political and operational pressure. Ukraine may need increasingly sophisticated methods of ensuring that drones behave safely when navigation is compromised, particularly when operating anywhere near NATO borders. That could involve route changes, redundant navigation systems, geofencing logic, or procedures that cause a drone to terminate its flight rather than continue after losing reliable positioning. War rarely allows perfect solutions, however. Russia will also continue adapting its electronic defenses. It becomes a contest between navigation and disruption, in which NATO countries can end up underneath the flight path. Could Russia deliberately divert Ukrainian drones? It is technically plausible that electronic warfare could alter or degrade a drone's navigation sufficiently to push it away from its intended route. What has not been established publicly in this incident is that Russia deliberately selected Latvia as the destination. That distinction should not be blurred. A Russian system attempting to protect Russian territory could create a diversion without its operators specifically intending the aircraft to cross into Latvia. There is nevertheless a strategic consequence for Moscow. If Russian electronic warfare repeatedly pushes Ukrainian drones towards NATO states, NATO will inevitably strengthen surveillance and air defenses in precisely the region Russia would prefer to keep militarily vulnerable. The tactic could therefore protect an immediate Russian target while accelerating a longer-term reinforcement of NATO's eastern frontier. NATO's eastern border is becoming part of the battle space. For years, NATO's eastern members warned that the war could not be treated as something geographically sealed inside Ukraine. Drone warfare is demonstrating why. A missile has a relatively predictable trajectory. A crewed aircraft has a pilot capable of responding to instructions. Autonomous or semi-autonomous drones operating amid intense electronic interference create something less predictable. They can disappear from control, follow corrupted navigation information, or continue towards an unintended area. When that area belongs to NATO, the alliance has no option but to respond. The August interception, therefore, represents more than successful air policing. It is another example of NATO being forced to manage the physical consequences of a war it is attempting to prevent from spreading directly onto alliance territory. What happens next? Latvia is likely to continue strengthening air defenses along its eastern frontier, while NATO refines how it responds to relatively cheap unmanned aircraft. The alliance has already moved far beyond simply watching Russian military aircraft near Baltic airspace. Its forces increasingly need to identify and potentially destroy drones whose ownership, mission, and navigation history may not be immediately obvious. Ukraine also faces pressure to make long-range strike systems more resilient to Russian interference and safer when missions fail. Russia, meanwhile, has little reason to reduce electronic warfare, while Ukrainian drones continue targeting infrastructure and military assets deep inside its territory. That leaves the Baltic states trapped beside an increasingly complex invisible battlefield. The drone destroyed over Latvia was Ukrainian. Latvia says Russian electronic warfare caused it to enter the country. NATO ultimately had to shoot it down. Those three facts together reveal the real danger. The Russia-Ukraine war no longer needs a deliberate attack on NATO territory to force NATO pilots into combat decisions above it.